Hello, everybody, and welcome. You are live on the Zach and Matt Show, as well as Joanathan Herzog's channel, as well as on Dan Price's Twitter. And we are very excited to introduce our first guest. He is the CEO of GravityPayments and is well known for, in 2015, taking a $1 million pay cut to give all of his employees a minimum wage of $70,000. Welcome, Dan Price. We're very excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Joanathan Herzog. Thank you to Dan Price, and thank you to Matthew Skidmore. You know him as the small business owner, the leading Yang Gang influencer, and the host of the one and only Zach and Matt Show. So exciting and epic and awesome to have you all here. Thank you again.
Thank you, Joanathan.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, so let's get started. Let's dive right in to this dialectic, and let's pull from some topical news, which is the recent conversation around universal basic income has blown up as we saw the promise of the single largest cash transfer in the country's history is now underway with a partnership of Give Directly, the likes of Google, Ariana Grande, Andrew Yang. The list goes on and on and on. And Dan, what makes Dan partly such an incredible leader and just courageous business person is he's one of the few voices from within the business community, from the entrepreneurial world, who's stood up and actually took a stand in favor of a universal basic income. So I want to start and ask you, Dan, taking this conversation with Mark Cuban, for instance, as a frame, and the recent piece also by Mark Andreessen about it's time to build things. There seems to be this fundamental question of what is the role of a universal basic income, if any, at this moment? Do we really need to feel like we have to fail in order to succeed? And why did you take the stance you have?
Well, Joanathan, you know, I've been studying business since I was a kid, basically. And, you know, a lot of people will say to me, hey, why don't you get more involved in politics? And why are you so slow to the game on things politically? And, you know, like I've been a practitioner of business since I was 12 years old. You know, I started a rock band when I was 12 and we had you know, somewhat of a business going. And then I started building my current business when I was 17. So I've been doing it for a while. And, you know, obviously we're all impacted by politics and decisions that are made. But as a business person, like I always want to come to the conversation with a fair amount of humility, just because, like, you know, I study this stuff. I'm passionate about it. I know it affects me so much. But I also know I don't have the same level of like practical practitioner type experience in politics or in public policy that I have in the business world. But what I do know from the business world is very much proof, I think, that the universal basic income is the right thing to do. For example, when you look at entrepreneurship, we're down about 40% on new business formation from the peak right now. What's worse than that is 40 years ago, a little bit less than half of all profit in the United States was made by the top 100 companies. That's gone up to 90%. So it's basically doubled in the last 40 years. So you have new business formation at a low point, number one. And number two, you have all the profits being concentrated in a few technology companies and a few other companies that take more of kind of a monopoly approach to life where they don't really want competition. In my world, the biggest, probably most influential book of the last 20 years is a book called 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, who's probably the most influential person in Facebook's culture. He's the co-founder, along with Elon Musk, of PayPal. He founded Palantir, which is a big, you know, government security contractor. And in this book, 0 to 1, he kind of has 2 points. Number one, the only people that matter are billionaires. If you want to matter in life, you have to be a billionaire. And there's really no other way. Like if you're not a billionaire, in his mind, I think, you know, I don't want to overstate it, but it's almost like you're like a second class of person that's somewhat like subhuman, sub-billionaire human. And then the second point that he makes is that competition sucks, that competition is not a good thing, you know, because He wants to become a billionaire. He wants to influence other people to want to have this winners take all mentality where the billionaires are the only ones that matter. And you can't become a billionaire unless you can act with impunity. And competition is kind of a check on business where we as consumers have choices. But if we have choices, then they can't take advantage of us in the same way. And you can't become a billionaire, you know, according to Peter Thiel, and I believe him, unless you can act with a certain level of impunity that comes with a more of a monopoly style business. So that's
but
all.
Dan, isn't this impunity the magic of Section 230 and the rise of the internet? And I mean, all of all the great innovation and digital technology is because we struck the balance in favor of innovation and growth. And aren't we reaping the benefit of that?
Yeah, but I want to set all of that as context for a very key question. What's something that bridges the political divide? Well, one thing is new business formation. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or a libertarian or a democratic socialist or anything else. One of the only things that all those people have in common, if you take out the Peter Thiels of the world, is we can all agree that having businesses form and be successful is a good thing. It creates economic mobility. It creates decision-making that's close to community rather than, you know, several steps removed. And if you go to people and you say, why are you not starting a new business? Why are you not going out there and becoming an entrepreneur? There's two answers, always. It's like 99.999% of the time. And the number one answer is always the same. Any guess what it is?
I mean, scarcity or some like, can't do it, can't even like
money.
Make ends meet now. Yeah.
Money. I need the tiniest amount of money. It's not a huge amount of money, but I need a little bit of money. If I just had a little bit of money, I could start my business, but because I don't, I can't. Then the number two reason, any guess?
Time.
Healthcare.
Healthcare.
Entrepreneurs, somebody that wants to start a business, they can find time. Like they have the ingenuity, they can find the time to make it work. But if they don't have the money for some very small basics, just not big things, just some basics, and they're dependent on their employer or the big companies for the healthcare advantage that big companies bring to the table. And so I think that is the genius of the UBI. And I think how, you know, many people like Andrew Yang, but frankly, as you've pointed out, many people for a long, long time have been advocating this. I know you've pointed out how, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. Advocated for this. And I know going way back to our country's founding, this was always a goal of some of even the founding fathers. So it goes way, way back. But the genius of it in terms of me, who I'm not a public policy expert from a practical practitioner standpoint, I'm a business person. I'm an entrepreneur. I work with entrepreneurs all the time. You know, there's probably about a dozen entrepreneurs right now that have, you know, $1 million+ companies that I mentored through the stages of signing their first customer or doing their first big deal or getting their product stood up for the first time. And these are the things in my circles that I see. Those are the two things. So if we as in a systemic way, like UBI, could solve that basic small amount, it gives people freedom. And I think that's another thing, that across the political divide, from a democratic socialist to a Democrat, to a Republican, to a libertarian, and almost everything else, people love freedom. They accuse each other of not liking freedom and all that. But if you really go to the people and talk to them that associate in those ways, they love freedom. UBI gives freedom. UBI equals freedom. And I think that's the message, but it's freedom to start a business. And also having that basic public policy of providing a healthcare for everybody, that presents freedom too. And I think that's the point that somebody like Mark Cuban misses when he says you have to have the failure hurt more to create a certain amount of desperation. In business, we accept a very common principle, which is whatever got you here in your business will not get you there in your business. And a lot has changed in the last 30 or 40 years. When those ideologies were developed, they probably were more defensible 40 years ago, frankly. Like for somebody to say that 40 years ago, when we were coming out of FDR's world rather than Ronald Reagan's world, like that made a little bit more sense because we had more of a social safety net and you had more people around you that were kind of part of the same class of human being. But now in Seattle, where I live, you know, it's just heartbreaking because we see this kind of subhuman ideology impacting people in the sense that there's homeless people right next to our office in Ballard. And, you know, we're, of course, been closed for 5 or 6 weeks now. But when we are open, we have this really nice, beautiful office. And then next door, there's a bunch of people that have no place to live. And so that ideology kind of playing through the system, we need a reset. We need this kind of human-centered capitalism or democratic socialism or whatever. I don't know the labels. I'm not into all that stuff. I'm just a practical business person. And if we bring UBI to the table and we start to kind of culturally get across the value of humanity over things like GDP or humanity over things like what is the stock market doing, and we kind of put those other things as points below the humanity, that is going to be so helpful. And where the rubber meets the road is if we put UBI in place and we put healthcare measures in place for people, we're going to see small business, entrepreneurship, innovation explode. We're all going to benefit from it. And the only people that won't benefit from it are the people maybe that are benefiting from the fact that there's monopolies at the top with no accountability and no competition.
So I want to bring in Matt to the conversation, but I want to just throw out there a quote from Anand Giridharadas from your recent interview with him, where he said, "Other CEOs were like, 'No, Dan, we're not with you, Dan. Absolutely not, Dan. Fuck you, Dan.'" So I want to just use that as a frame and let Matt jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just think with this whole thing with Mark Cuban, when he said, even if you agree with what he said, which is the pressure to fail is necessary to succeed, the idea that by getting a universal basic income of, say, $1,000 a month, that suddenly you no longer have the pressure of failing, it seems a little bit of a stretch to me, because at the end of the day, $1,000 a month is only going to take you so far. And even if you get an extra $1,000 a month and you do take that money and you want to try to invest it or start a business, there's still a risk associated with that. You can definitely still fail. It's not like you have a blank checkbook with millions of dollars. It's $1,000. So I think it's kind of just an oversimplification.
But I will say that we as human beings, for some reason in our culture, we're obsessed with motivation. So I was giving a speech one time at the Inc. 5000 conference, right? So these are the 5,000 fastest growing companies, private companies in the United States. And they were talking about how if you pay everybody $70,000 a year, they won't be motivated. They won't want to do anything. They won't want to advance their life. And so I asked the crowd, you know, I'm on stage and I'm like, well, what motivates all of you? Let's just get like 4 or 5 people to jump in. And it was like, oh, I want to change the world. I want to make the world a better place, all that kind of thing. And I was like, and what motivates your employees, right? These are executives, CEOs, owners. And they're like, well, they just want to raise. They don't want to get fired. Like, we have to keep them kind of under our thumb in like a desperate way. These are very successful business people that think that. And one of the things, there's a case study on GravityPayments that they teach at Harvard Business School. And when they teach that at Harvard Business School, they teach about how we have this kind of unhealthy and misguided obsession with motivation. Because most of us are intrinsically motivated. Most of us actually have something we really care about that we want to make a difference in. And all of us pretty much want to get better at things and want to be part of something better, like bigger than ourselves that we care about. But it's not motivation that we have to fix in the United States. It's actually capability and license. And so when you give somebody a UBI or when you give somebody a $70,000 minimum wage, all of a sudden they're able to think long term. They're able to invest in their long-term future and success in a way that increases their capability. Case in point, there's a gentleman named Jose Garcia at Gravity. And after he got the raise, he moved close to the office. He started, exercising. He kind of like started doing like fitness blogging, and he's lost 120 pounds.
Yeah.
Since he got the $70,000 minimum wage. And the experts would have told you Jose would have, gained weight. He would have lost motivation, all that. But it's really capability. And then the other part is license. When I was talking to Anand yesterday, and I'm glad you brought that up, there was a gentleman that came on after me to talk to Anand. And he said the phrase, "I don't matter." Like us at the bottom, we don't matter.
Right.
And I think that with what we're paying and how we're kind of treating people in our society, we're basically telling more and more people that they don't matter every single year. And we're marketing that to people and they don't believe it. And that's where the license comes in. So with a UBI, there's an implicit message. You matter. I want to invest in you. I believe in you. And I think about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. He said, "You matter. I like you because you're you." And he believed that you could only grow if somebody accepted you and invested in you just the way you are. We have right now a culture in the United States that's based on shame and guilt and cancel culture and all these things. And this is the antidote to that, is telling people every single month to the tune of $1,000, you matter, we're trusting you. And Fred Rogers, they were going to cancel his show. They were going to cancel PBS. And he went to the Republican senator that was the most powerful person. And he said, we as kids, you have to learn to trust people. I'm going to trust that you're going to read what I wrote very carefully and consider what I'm saying. And you could see the light turn on for that guy who wanted to cancel PBS, where all of a sudden somebody trusted him. Somebody put faith in him that it was surprising. This is a powerful man, the chairman of the committee. And just hearing Fred Rogers say to him, "I trust you enough that I want to invest in you. I believe you." It shifted his mindset. And at the end of the presentation, he said, "You just got your $20 million of funding for PBS." So a lot of these kind of like different nodes that seem like they're not really connected, where like we believe in shaming each other, we believe in tearing each other down. If we can start to have a culture of investing in each other, in trusting each other, and also we have to understand that just because one person does the wrong thing, if 999 people do the right thing, the cost of enforcement to make sure that one person doesn't do the right thing, and we're going to hurt all 999 to prevent that one person, it doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. I mean, it's similar to the idea of like, if you cut young childhood education, then you have to increase the funding for incarceration, and you're making humanity suffer, and you're breaking the hearts of moms and dads and sisters and brothers and kids. Or you can invest in childhood education. So it's a little bit of a shift of this trust first, lean with humanity. And it's like there are countries in the world right now that have this culture that are wonderful. Yeah. I went to Costa Rica maybe like 5 years ago. Yeah. And I would ask them, "Oh, have you ever been to the United States?" Most countries, they're like, "Oh, I've always wanted to go." In Costa Rica, they were like, "Why would I do that? This is such a wonderful place. Everybody's so nice here." And I really did experience that. And this is a country where they spend a significant amount of their national resources on providing education, healthcare, and environmental protection. And then they take care of each other. And so I think the culture that we can aspire to with UBI is the idea of, I trust you to take care of yourself, but I'm going to give you resources to take care of yourself. And then once you've taken care of yourself, I trust you to help other people also take care of themselves. I think if we can kind of shift to that, it incorporates, people that maybe have been part of the Trump movement, people that have been part of the Bernie movement, people that have been a part of the Elizabeth Warren movement, and so many other movements. And it kind of brings them all together in a way where we can flourish together as a society. And you're going to see more entrepreneurs out there like me in that environment. Right now, you say, why aren't there more people like Dan? Well, we're kind of teaching people in my profession to slash and burn, trust no one, take everything that you can for yourself. And by the way, you can do some philanthropy and hire a PR firm and it'll all be good.
Yeah, wow. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. And I want to try to extract maybe some common motifs and themes. And I think one of the things that I draw from this philosopher named Roberto Unger is the idea of fighting for deep freedom and not shallow equality, and how that manifests in federal policy and legislation. And so I thought one interesting example is when you set this floor, this 70,000 floor, which, by the way, I thought it was hilarious how you'd mentioned how you were looking at the behavioral economics research on it and kind of were like, oh, it's like 75, so I'll set it at 70. But actually just so fascinating, because we actually invented this entire field. And the author of that HBS case was my thesis supervisor, actually, Michael Norton.
Yeah, I know Mike.
Yeah.
Him and I have traveled together and spoken together. So that's how I know.
Oh, that's amazing.
As well. Yeah,
that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. But so this entire field was actually just like invented kind of out of whole cloth, and it just illustrates how we can challenge some of these intuitions around, for instance, the drivers of happiness, the drivers and the structure of incentives within firms and within business formation, because now we have more data and we have more tools like prospect theory and loss aversion and the entire field of that Kahneman and Tversky invented to do that. So when you set it to 70K, you'd mentioned that some folks were kind of frustrated because, you know, they were in the trenches and they kind of had to grow in the ranks and, fight the fight to get the promotion. And there's a kind of similar critique from the left about a universal basic income, as opposed to more tailored or targeted or means-tested solutions, in that it's like, what, you're going to give $1,000 a month to everyone, regardless of where they are or who they are? How is that fair? And so it's really interesting. What is your notion of fairness, and how do you bake that into policy? Is it fair because it's the same across the board, and the way we're financing it is actually going to make it the most progressive federal policy? Or is it fair if it's, again, to that particular employee, well, I went through the trenches, so they must too. This sort of retribution idea that someone else has to suffer because I did.
It's kind of like hazing is what it reminds me of.
Right, exactly.
And I remember, when I came up in high school, I was homeschooled until like kind of middle school, high school. But I remember how, there was hazing that would happen. And literally one time a guy told me if I didn't give myself a wedgie and pull it over my head, like he would do it. And he was serious. You know what I mean? I won't tell you how the story ended, but he was really serious. And I remember thinking I am just not going to do that when I'm a junior or senior in high school. But the critique is fair in the sense that if you were hazed or if you didn't have enough, it's not fair that somebody afterwards has a better life than you. But at the same time, isn't that why we're here? Isn't that why what we aspire for is to help the next generation be better? I think that we've had a history and a tradition of that in this country. And there's a lot of baby boomers that believe in that, but as a generation, it seems like it's a little bit less like that. And I think we have to think about more in terms of paying it forward, because what's also true is a lot of us still have a far better life than people did in human history. If you go back and look at the book Sapiens or any of these history of the world type books, we have a lot of advantages that other people don't have, and it feels good. It's liberating to invest and help other people succeed. Matt, I don't know what you think, but I just feel like it's just a great thing to do.
No, it absolutely is to help other people. And I know when you ran your business, it's got to be, it's a stressful feeling to feel like that you're accountable for, hundreds of employees and their livelihood. And when you're able to do something like give everybody a $70,000 raise, it does make you feel like you're making a difference in people's lives. And that's definitely something that as a society, people should just be focused on, just trying to help your neighbor, help your community out. I think in terms of the whole, like, with universal basic income, people talk about why should the rich person get it, or why should this person get it? They make this much money. They make this much more than me. And I mean, if you really think about it, you can just look at the current situation with the COVID-19 stimulus payments. Some of them are going to take 5 months to get from the payments being passed into law to then actually getting to the recipient. And that's all because of the bureaucracy and paperwork and, reporting methods that goes into when you means test a policy like this. So that's really why there's a lot of technical reasons why universal basic income, the universality of it, is so important. And then there's just also a lot of it just kind of changing the way we as a society view each other, and just changing the mindset in terms of helping people.
Hey, so I got kind of a policy thing to throw out to you two that's been bouncing around in my head, but I really, like I said, I'm an amateur at best. But like that second one, why people don't start businesses. I have 20,000 small business clients, and they lost on average 55% of their business over the past 6 weeks, which means I lost 55% of my business over the past 6 weeks. And I hear multiple times an hour in many cases of businesses that are going under. And it's just like being like kicked in the gut. So I really do think UBI could help, because as Matt was pointing out, it's a lot of pressure being a business owner. And if you can get more money to your employees and more security to your employees, it takes pressure off and it opens up creativity for somebody like me. But I was thinking about that second piece from a healthcare standpoint. The government has a really nice healthcare program for government employees. So if you're a government employee, if you're a member of Congress, for example, like it's very, very good, top-notch health insurance that you get. And so I was thinking about how UBI would help small businesses so much. It would help create demand. It would help create more new business formation, entrepreneurship. Like that money would get to the best places from an economist standpoint. But I thought about that healthcare thing, maybe very small businesses like less than 500 employees or less than 250 employees or less than 100 employees should have access to the government healthcare system, maybe on a temporary basis to start out with, and make it more permanent. But I think right now, obviously, is an opportunity where there's probably more of an appetite for UBI because there's such an obvious need, and that will change some hearts and minds. But I thought about the same thing from a healthcare standpoint. If we gave these small businesses a break from having to have this huge competitive disadvantage that favors the huge businesses and really guts the small businesses. I mean, when I was building Gravity, for most of the first 5, 6, 7 years, my healthcare bill was greater than all my taxes combined. So you literally could have doubled my taxes and given me healthcare, and I'm a net positive. And that's not true for like super profitable, super successful companies, but they're all doing fine. So if we want to help out with having more companies being successful rather than concentrating all the success at the top, if you basically had a healthcare system and said to your large companies, hey, to start with, like, you're not going to be in the system, we're going to test it out with the smaller companies, it would provide somewhat of a stair step. And I think one of the things that's tough is there's precedent in these other countries that have good healthcare systems. I mean, like the NHS in England is extremely popular. But just for Americans, I feel like we need our own program before we can really trust in it. And it's tough to have that middle step. So some people talk about public option, all that. But it strikes me that if you basically allowed all small businesses to opt into the government program, you could probably cut their healthcare costs in half. You could all of a sudden negotiate really strongly against pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. And the only people that would lose would really be the lobbyists of the pharmaceutical and insurance companies, and then, you know, the kind of CEOs, executives, and shareholders of those companies. But our whole society would win. Now, I'm not smart enough to put this into any kind of a detailed proposal, but I'm curious what you all think about something like that.
I think it's an interesting idea. I haven't heard it before in terms of taking the healthcare burden off of the businesses' backs and putting that on the government. That would definitely, it would help the business owners because they wouldn't have to be worrying about that anymore. And it would also help all of the employees because they're not worried about losing their health insurance if their business does go under. So this might be the time, you know, with all the new experimental things they're doing to try to move in that direction. I don't really see any downsides.
I love too how it would really like take away, because right now there's a huge disincentive to work for a small company. And there's also just a huge economic disadvantage that any small company has vis-a-vis a larger company. And I think, you know, we need a few policies that are kind of laser focused at fixing that. One that I particularly like that has not gotten a lot of traction is Elizabeth Warren was proposing this idea that companies over $1 billion in sales, if they did something that caused a problem for somebody else, if they harmed somebody else, they would be financially liable. So if a big company did something and you were harmed as an individual by it, or your company was harmed, you could actually sue that big company. And the reason why that's important is that huge companies have so many armies of lawyers, which small companies don't. And so they can kind of figure out a way to be very harmful and belligerent in their activity, but in a way that doesn't technically break the law. And so there's no catch-all. And then we create these types of systems where the small companies don't have the lawyers to be able to get away with this stuff. So they have the disadvantage. The big companies that have the lobbyists and the lawyers, they can kind of do whatever they want, and there's no way of holding them accountable. So I really like the idea of doing whatever we can to help our small businesses to be more viable, looking at just how dire the statistics are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Johnathan, I kind of have a question for you. What do you think with the whole issue with the small business grants in terms of they passed it a few weeks ago as part of one of the phase bills, and then just the other day they refunded the small business programs, but they only funded it for 2 days, and really they should have passed that bill a week ago. And it seems like that the big corporations are always prioritized first, and the small businesses, they get the back end of the shoe, even though that the small businesses employ, I'm pretty sure, more people than the big businesses. And the big businesses in these types of situations, they're usually going to be fine. It is the small businesses that are most at risk to go under. How do you think from a government perspective that we can actually have our lawmakers prioritize small businesses and people over corporations?
This is a fundamental challenge, and I think Dan has been one of the most outspoken and really concrete and specific on some of the key failures of the small business bailout rollout. And to your point, Matt, there's a real fundamental divide. If you're a large multinational, publicly listed firm, you're getting cold cash and like infinite capital. And if you're a small or medium enterprise, you're getting possibly, maybe, if you jump through many, many hoops and the bureaucracy, some loans. And these are important steps. We have to be not grateful, but we have to celebrate when people come from across the aisle and actually accomplish something. But I mean, it's shameful. But I think it just illustrates the importance of, I think what is so powerful about this movement is we really look to root cause analysis, right? We look many, many, many steps upstream. And I think one of the most prominent ones, one of the most powerful, influential ones is in campaign financing. And Larry Lessig has really, kind of led this fight for public financing of elections and a reform of the Electoral College and gerrymandering and ranked choice voting. But really fundamentally, publicly financed elections and democracy vouchers, which I guess Dan can actually maybe speak to, because one of the only real test cases we have in the United States is in Seattle. But I think that, again, none of these things are fundamentally panaceas, not the UBI, not even publicly financed elections. But I think the power of and the value that we add is, again, in thinking like many, many, many steps back into what are the root causes for why in the first place a legislator would preference the interests of a hedge fund or a PE firm or a multinational tech firm over the interests of a small business.
Well, and just for everybody out there too, just to break down some of the technical details of this legislation, the PPP program that was part of the CARES Act. So it's administered through banks. Banks get, I believe it's a 5% fee for administering it. They take no risk. So like if a bank, doles out like $1 million loan, they take no risk and they get paid $50,000 to do that. And then they also have the ability to decide where that money goes. They get to decide who's first in line and who's second in line and who's third in line. And they want to go to the people that have the closest relationship with them, that they want to protect that relationship with, for two reasons. One is just strictly like a sales, business development, relationship building reason. They want to protect their revenue and they can say, hey, I'll hook you up and you hook me up. And so it's a bit of a unspoken quid pro quo. But the second one is even more nefarious. The second one is that they'll go to people that owe them money already, that they have a previous lending relationship with, and they'll give them that money first, because we basically given the banks kind of the God power to decide who gets the money and who doesn't, even though they have no risk. And they're saying, instead of taking this money and putting it to the highest public good, which they have under the legislation no duty to do, and that's criminal. Like the banks should have had some duty to put the money where it was most needed and to put the people that are most in need at the front of the line. They didn't, so they did the opposite. And they gave the money primarily to people that already owed them money. And that money is fungible. So they want to save the companies that owe them money already. So if you have a business where you're small and you're not the most sophisticated, you don't have enough money to have like a chief financial officer and a fancy lawyer and a fancy private banker, you basically have a very little chance of getting to the front of the line over all those other people. But what's also true is that's the business that needed the money most. And so that was the failing in the legislation, is basically allowing the banks to decide who's at the front of the line, and knowing full well that the banks would choose to give the money not to the people that need it the most, but to the people where it would benefit the bank the most. I saw on my Twitter feed, and somebody can look, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he has an online pet supply business. So they're up 50% because of COVID-19, which he shared publicly. Because, if you're in an online e-commerce business right now, you've really benefited from shifting all the purchasing from being in person to be online. So he's up 50%. His business has never been more profitable. It's never been better off. And Chase said to him, hey, we can get you $300,000 of free money, no strings attached. We will have the taxpayer pay for your payroll for the next 2 months. And because of that, we're going to take that money away from somebody who maybe lost 80 to 100% of their business, doesn't have the sophistication, because we're trying to build our relationship. Thank God for him. He called them out on Twitter. It's Chase Bank. But I would say if anybody out there is with Chase Bank, we just need to pass laws and make this not possible, because right now the incentive is for this nefarious behavior from the likes of Chase Bank. But until we pass those laws, I think we need to try to change our behavior. So if you work with Chase Bank, especially if you get your credit card processing through Chase Bank, give us a call, because we do not want to be supporting this type of behavior that's really hurting all of us. In the coronavirus, we weren't prepared. So right now there's a certain amount of making up the rules as we go, and that's dangerous. And we need to be able to trust each other. So when people are acting in bad faith so clearly like those, we have to have some way of holding people accountable.
Yeah, so I'm running for Congress in New York's 10th district, which is the world's financial capital. It covers Wall Street, the investment management firms, the corporate law firms. Literally covers Wall Street. It's also where 1 in 6 people live in poverty. And to your point, you can look across the street and you have squalor and public housing on the other side, a luxury development. So it's this really stark kind of microcosm of these winner-take-all forces, the financialization, the automation. But I want to kind of hone in on something you alluded to, and maybe because you're working in fintech, right? And one of the things I kept thinking about was, well, what about internet money? What about crypto? Like we're speaking about, well, you basically have the Fed and the Treasury, right? You have kind of Steve Mnuchin and, let's say Larry Fink and Associates. And then on the other side, you have sort of private enterprise, right? Let's say Zuckerberg, Bezos, et cetera. And what entity or what institution would you have the most faith in? And perhaps it is you as a small business owner, right? Somewhere in the middle there, caught in that midst. But what role, if any, do you think that cryptocurrency or just internet money or a different model itself might play in this?
Yeah, great question. So a little bit of context. The way I found quote unquote fintech and credit card processing and all that is my band used to play at this coffee shop, and the coffee shop owner was explaining to me that it costs her like 3-4% just to get paid on a credit card. Right, and that just seemed so unfair. Like it was her 4th highest cost of doing business after like things that we know are expensive: rent, employees, and cost of goods sold. And that didn't make any sense to me. So I'm like, okay, that seems wrong. And so we jumped in. That was kind of the first thing that we did. We said, we're just going to charge half of the margin of everybody else in this industry, not have sales reps necessarily that are like commission based. So like our sales reps are salary based. So we don't have that extra fee. And then a lot of our sales, our top way of getting sales is via word of mouth referral. So that was the first thing, is like, just allow the small business to accept any form of payment they want. So we aggregate, Visa, MasterCard, Chase, Bank of America, PayPal, Apple Pay, Google Pay, all these things. So a small business can take whatever they want. So any of our 20,000 small businesses, if they started to say like, we want to go the crypto route, we want to accept crypto, we can turn that on very quickly, and people in our industry can turn it on very quickly. So the rails are there, the infrastructure is there to do it. What's missing from the equation is consumers aren't regularly going to businesses and asking to pay with crypto. The second thing that we do, which we shifted, because at first there were all these big, monopolies and payment processing companies that were overcharging merchants. We wanted to prevent that. And that was kind of like our big bad wolf, for lack of a better term, as a company. But as we got more like down the road toward like digital transformation as a society, like Amazon and Starbucks and other kind of monopoly style type players became more of a threat to small businesses than the Visa and MasterCards and the big banks of the world. So we had to shift to actually creating commerce technology that would allow like a small business to accept payment, not just in person, but also e-commerce, mobile, text to pay, email to pay, all that. And that further kind of creates the potential and rails for something like crypto. So I don't have a crystal ball. I think the logic of it like makes some sense at times. I do hear things like the energy usage with Bitcoin, which last I checked exceeds every solar panel in the world. And things like that kind of scare me from an efficiency standpoint. I know in theory it'll get better as we get kind of more, water kind of under the bridge. But like for us, we just want a small business to just be able to accept whatever the consumer needs them to accept. And that's really kind of like how we think about it. And if that's crypto someday, that's crypto. I I hear what you're saying about like, where do you put your faith? Where do you put your trust? It's a really, really tough question. And I think it's one that we're going to be struggling with for a little while.
I want to bring in Matt before I bring us out another rabbit hole.
On financial technology?
Or just anything.
There's
a lot of ground we've been covering.
Well, I have a question. What do you think of the whole debate right now in terms of $15 minimum wage versus UBI, or should there be a combination of both? Where do you guys fall on that question? Because I kind of have my own opinion, but I'll wait for you guys to go first.
You're up, Jonathan.
So I think that I do kind of share the Andrew Yang bias on this, but I think Dan is such an interesting interlocutor for this question, because Dan offers this interesting alternative where one of the early models in internet regulation, and kind of the de facto way internet regulation works, is we say we're going to self-regulate, right? So firms will define the boundaries. They have the technical expertise and know-how. We know that our legislature is decades behind understanding technology. They don't even use apps and smartphones, and sometimes not even email. So it's essentially like we're going to outsource this entire part of policymaking in the same way we've allowed self-regulation and regulatory capture generally. But I think Dan was this fascinating natural experiment, right? Like, you don't often get the case where you just like inject, like you have this strong control group, and then you have this strong variable where you're like, suddenly, there's a $70,000 minimum income floor. And one of the most fascinating things I found, Dan, in your discussion of it, I haven't looked at your data, but just from your anecdotal representation, is you saw these second and third order effects that you may not have even expected. Like you talked about increase in home ownership, an increase in birth rate, an increase in savings rate. And now these are some of the promise, right? Some of the empirical promise from some of the work done in Kenya and other developing countries, and also some of the projects and experiments in UBI in Canada and the United States from a number of decades ago. But it's just fascinating to have seen that within your own firm, because it's like you're like a little lab, and you were able to see the results in real time. So would love to hear your perspective on this.
I had initially one goal when I did the $70,000 minimum wage, and then my goal shifted quite a bit, and I succeeded at my first goal and I failed at my second, failed miserably.
Okay.
So my first goal was to make all of our lives, myself included, at Gravity better.
Okay.
And that worked unquestionably. As you said, we went from having 0 to 2 babies born across the company per year to like last year we had 15 babies born across the company. We had people double to triple their savings rate. 70% of people reported they pay down debt. And we had probably 5 to 10x first-time home ownership rate compared to before.
And this isn't like mandated. This isn't like the firm management being like, you must have a child or you must save X%.
No. So it's like everyone was saying, oh, if you give people more money, they'll waste it. That's like a common line that the likes of like Republican strategist Frank Luntz and other people with a lot of Koch money dollars behind them get out there into the conversation. And we start to hear it from our friends and family.
Yeah, it's really just like a straw man argument.
Yeah, but it works, right? Because we've all heard it from our friends and family that are very well-meaning with big hearts, with the right. It's like they pick an argument that will be hard to disprove directly, because like it's like unprovable and unprovable, and so it just is kind of like the other hand in the dialect. So it's like we know that those challenges are there, but we prove that those are false. Also, the firm tripled, GravityPayments tripled in processing volume from 2015 through kind of like the beginning of 2020. I don't want to talk about the rest of 2020 because it's a bit of a sore subject for us right now. But up until that point, right, we had tripled as a company. And so there was a lot. So we proved that it can work. We proved that it does work. You know, we didn't necessarily prove that it works for everybody. And as some people pointed out, maybe you would have been even more successful if you haven't done it. You know, that's a good point. I can't prove that wrong directly. But at minimum, we proved it can work. But I think, unfortunately, with my second goal was to kind of rally consumer choice and rally humanity and like get it to kind of scale. And I literally was on Fox News saying, hey, if you don't want government regulation, because I know your audience, I know who's listening to me right now. If you don't want government regulation, then you need your businesses to do this. Period. This would be a very effective form if you're really trying to prevent regulation like you say you are. And of course, they were throwing me under the bus. They were saying that, quote, they said, quote unquote, our employees would end up on the breadlines because of the motivation that they would lose from this decision. And unfortunately, the second thing that we proved was that companies won't en masse volunteer to do something like this. You have to have a forcing mechanism. So I got a random call from a woman that her name's Megan Driscoll, and she's in Boston. And she told me about how she was doubling the minimum wage at her firm. And that was so inspiring to me. And that made me think, oh, this can spread. And, you know, I got one just a month ago, somebody that I don't have permission to name yet, but a pharmacy in rural Missouri that's like doubled their lowest paid employees from like $12 an hour to $24 an hour. And like using the principles in my book, Worth It, using the principles that I'm putting out there through my various, you know, places where I'm writing, and showing that it works for other companies too. We've had, you know, dozens of examples of this, but it just takes a few bad companies to kind of like poison the well for everybody else. And that's why you do need some kind of democratic, systemic solution. And I think if you just raise the minimum wage, I think you need some way to subsidize that in the short term for small businesses until the economic activity and the demand picks up. It'll pay for itself in time, but it takes probably, I don't know, 6 months or 6 years or somewhere in between to really filter through to, like, for example, one of my neighbors is Cupcake Royale. She's been one of my longest standing customers. She's got she's been with Gravity for 16 years. And you know, she just talks about how she literally can't afford the type of minimum wage that she would like to. And so all of a sudden, if you're concentrating all the wealth with the wealthiest companies, you're taking it all away from the small businesses, and you take away an employee's choice to be able to work for a small business that can't afford to pay them as much because they think it's a better career opportunity. That's problematic. It's probably still on the balance the best thing to do. But if you put some of these compensatory measures in place, if you started to pick up the tab for healthcare for small businesses, if you kind of like phased in some type of tax credit for small businesses to ease the burden from the minimum wage over a 1 to 5 year period and then phased it out, I think some of those bridges could bring that together. I think if you get small businesses behind a high minimum wage, or even just a historically kind of normal minimum wage, because right now we're low, if you get the small businesses behind it, I think it would become politically, you know, passable. I think it would go, because right now the last line of defense for people that are against it are pointing at the small businesses.
Small business, exactly.
And I also wonder if you started with UBI and then you did minimum wage second, if that would be another way to accomplish the same thing. Because I think the UBI would disproportionately help the people at the bottom. A lot of the small businesses that are like my friend Jody of Cupcake Royale, they're the people at the bottom in terms of their employees and everything. So if you started with the UBI and then phased up the minimum wage second, that'd be another way to get there. So I don't want to take any steam. I really admire the people with like the Fight for 15 movement and the people with the minimum wage movement. I'm not against you. I'm 100% appreciative of what you're doing, but I'm just trying to say, from a business person's perspective, here's a path to get there where you could get the business community behind you. And you wouldn't have people like me who are in general so supportive, worried about my friend Jody and her losing her business because of the legislation.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of good points there, and especially this whole idea that people having their income levels raised is going to make them lazier. It's just a bunch of hogwash. You've seen it in your company. You see it in all the different trials and experiments. Unfortunately, not more of them that have gone on in throughout the world. Every single study says the same thing. Productivity rates go up. All the home ownership, you talked about birth rates, it all goes up. And I just know that, like, if I was working at that pharmacy that you talked about, making $12 an hour, and be during a pandemic when the business's bottom line is falling, and they decide to actually take care of me and make sure that I'm good and give me a double my income to $24, I would walk into that company the next day with a smile on my face. I'd be 5 times happier to go out and do everything I could to make sure I'm doing my job correctly. On a So they'll, whether it's through a minimum wage or a UBI or both, the idea that raising people's income is going to make them worse off is a total cop out. And like, you kind of just have to question like how you're like, it doesn't make any logical sense to me when you think about it. But on the question of minimum wage, my concern is similar to what Dan touched on. Is I want people to have more money in their pockets. I want them to be better off. But I do wonder how much a minimum wage, such as especially a $15 federally mandated minimum wage, would affect small businesses. And I can speak from my own experience a little bit, because when I was 15, I started my own e-commerce business, and I would start hiring, people who worked for, or I went to school with, or my friends, and I was paying them, $9-10 an hour, not much, but not $15. And I'd know that if there was a federally mandated $15 minimum wage, it would have been harder for me to start my business. Have only been able to hire one person instead of, I think I had 2 helpers starting out. And I know it would have made it getting to the point where my business was, before I got into Andrew Yang, and it kind of took the back burner a bit, to where at the end of last spring, I had 6 people working for me, and every single one of them was making over $15 an hour. I know that if I was at that point where there was a $15 minimum wage back when I had started, it would have taken me a longer duration of time to actually get to the point where my business was able to take care of everyone. I do think, and that kind of goes to show, all the big companies like Amazon, the Walmarts, the Targets of the world, they can definitely afford $15 an hour minimum wages for their workers. They just don't want to do it because companies care about their bottom line. Usually, I guess Dan's the exception. But so I ultimately think it comes down to, I think that's why I really like UBI over the minimum wage, because I don't think the UBI, it hurts small business. I think a federally mandated minimum wage, I do think it disproportionately would affect small businesses versus a UBI, where I don't think it's going to disproportionately affect anyone as long as it's funded with the proper VAT tax. So that's kind of my opinions and thoughts on it.
I want to actually kind of maybe take a couple of steps back and peel some of the layers back behind who we are as people. And I want to read just a quick thought, a quick quote, again from the same philosopher, Roberto Unger, which is, "To change everything, you must resist. To resist, you must be willing to accept failure, derision, embarrassment, defeat. Most of us are hostage to the accidents of our formation." And I think, to me, it's just so important to, again, kind of roll back the layers a little bit. And one of the powers of the grace and the vulnerability that is baked into this whole movement is that we can do just that. And so would love to talk a little bit about, kind of both of your upbringing. And I mean, Dan, growing up in rural Idaho, the evangelical Christians, to kind of where you are now, just to kind of pull back some of the layers here of all the technical policy jargon.
Yeah, so I grew up reading the Bible up to 3 hours a day. We would arise like first thing in the morning, and it was neither one of my parents went to college, and they started having kids in their early 20s. Like I think my mom was 20 and my dad was 22, and they had 6 kids pretty quickly. So they did not sign up for an easy life. And the way it worked was my mom was like in charge of parenting and my dad was in charge of making money. And so they both had a lot of work to do because it takes a lot of money to have a family of 8, without any college degrees. So my dad was just grinding like crazy all the time, and my mom was trying her best to keep us educated and fed and all those things. And they were really heroic, especially when they remember my name. I feel like, wow, how did you just do that? Like that's very, very impressive, especially when you consider that in my family it went boy, 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 me, girl, boy. So
Oh, wow.
So, if you think of like firstborn, lastborn, only girl, all those things, my situation was I had kind of a somewhat of an anonymous upbringing, which suited me fine and helped me. But we listened to Rush Limbaugh from 10 to 1 every single day. My parents were super excited once Rush Limbaugh started covering me and talking about me on air. They called me up and they said, Dan, you got to turn on your radio right now, only to have Rush Limbaugh basically say that their son was a complete failure and, was going to be a horrible person and was like the most dangerous CEO and would be a case study. That your friend Mike, your professor Mike, that the case study that he wrote, the top line is a quote from Rush Limbaugh about how it should be a case study for how, this stuff's going to fail. And, my parents, I asked them a painful question, which they've refused to answer, which is I asked them what line would have to be crossed where enough is enough politically. And they tell me that they have a line, but they're not comfortable sharing it with me. And I don't know why that is. But it gives you a little bit of a flavor of kind of like that situation, because it's like, okay, like we say that we care about family values, but are we okay separating immigrants and putting kids into like a horrible, situation, or housing, immigrants in a place where they're going to die? The Bible teaches about how you're supposed to treat those people like Jesus. That's literally what the Bible that I grew up reading said. And that's the same Bible that my parents taught me to read. And, but it's funny, the perspectives, because I sometimes ask my mom, my dad has this cheesy joke, which is their mom taught them to think independently and now she wishes she hadn't, is kind of the joke that my dad tells about my mom. And I asked her one time, I was like, Mom, if you wanted me to turn out, kind of like down the line evangelical conservative Christian without my own ideas or without my own like thinking, why were you reading me Les Miserables when I was like 8 years old? You know what I mean? Like that doesn't seem to go together. And she's like, well, Les Miserables is about a guy who was living a life of crime, who turned his life around by committing himself to Jesus. And I'm like, no. Les Miserables is about an evil, system that was holding people down in poverty and how we all need to rise up and change it. So it's amazing the level of kind of perspective if you look at the same kind of facts and everything. And I think it's important for somebody that has my background, because the Bible thousands and thousands of times talks about how you treat the immigrant, how you treat the poor, how you treat a sex worker, how you treat, all these people that are disadvantaged. The Bible is primarily, there's lots of crazy stuff in there that's just like not good. Like, like poisoning your wife if you think she might be cheating on you, which is like recommended in Leviticus. Like, I don't like that part of it, but there's a lot of really good stuff in the Bible that's really relevant to right now. And there are very few things in the Bible about kind of like judging other people, trying to create laws to enforce your lifestyle on other types of people. And if you look at kind of the contemporary evangelical Christian movement, it's focused on those 2 or 3 things that don't really get a lot of traction in the Bible. And so I think that it's like trying to be open-minded to other people's perspectives and seeing kind of the good in what they do is what I pull out of my background. And the other thing, though, that some Gravity employees, one in particular, pulled me aside and he said, I think I was doing an interview with like Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, who, huge fan of his. And he was asking me about, like, how much do you think, like, your decisions at Gravity have to do with your conservative Christian upbringing? It's impossible to know the answer to a question like that. And it's kind of easy when a reporter asks you that just to be like, oh, yeah, it goes along with this verse and that verse. But I had a Gravity employee kind of pull me aside and be like, I think you're far more influenced by the people around you right now, the small business customers of Gravity and the 200 people like me that you work with every day. And like, some of those people are Trump voters. Some of those people are Bernie voters. Some of those, we love diversity. You know what I mean? We have like fundamentalist evangelical Christians who work alongside, you know, somebody who just went through a gender transition, and they love and support each other. They don't see each other as enemies. You know what I mean? They don't see each other as like infringing on each other. And I think that is like what most informs like how I am today, is like all of those different people coming together, being vulnerable with me, being honest with me. It's a huge gift as a CEO to have people be honest with you, because it's really easy to collect people around you that are going to tell you what you want to hear. And having, you know, that guy pull me aside that day and say, don't say that to Nick Kristof. You know what I mean? Like, that's wrong. Like, I had that blind spot. I needed to hear that from him. And I think maybe at times I, and probably a lot of us, make a little bit too much of our personal backgrounds and forget the community that's around us right here and now supporting us, which still includes my parents. My parents are my best friends. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to stop being best friends with them over politics, but I have a lot of other best friends that are involved in very different movements from my parents that probably are more relevant to how I see the world today.
Wow, a lot there. Want to bring Matt in and then kind of push on some of those.
Yeah, this is hard. This is gonna be a hard one to follow up.
No, I'm good at ranting, Matt.
I mean, I could talk a little bit about like religion. Similar to you, Jonathan, I was raised in a Jewish household. I attended Hebrew school from like the age of 4 all the way up till I was confirmed when I was in 10th grade. I had like a bar mitzvah and all that. So, but you know, I think back on it now, like, you know, first day of they call it Torah for Tots, is the kindergarten or preschool version of Hebrew school. I can't think back now and being like, oh yes, that was the moment where you know, I got all these great values instilled upon me, and that's made me into, you know, whoever I am now. I can't remember back that far. I think Dan makes a really great point in terms of it is a lot of who you have around you. You know, I have a close friend of mine. He's struggled with drug abuse. You know, he's about 31 years old, but he struggled with drug abuse, you know, his entire adult life. And I think on issues like drug reform, that's given me a lot of perspective and seeing how the various proposals thrown out by politicians on either side would help or hurt him. You know, one of the women who worked for me at my company, she was a single mom, you know, a young single mother, and who still lived with her family, and you know, kind of, but not in the best domestic situation. And so you kind of you look at all these people in your life, and you kind of wonder, why isn't the system? It seems like that the system, as Bernie Sanders kind of says, and I agree with him on this, in the greatest country in the world, the richest country in the world, why is it that we have millions of homeless people, that like veterans that are homeless on the streets? Why do we have such high levels of crime and violence? And you begin to like look around, and you wonder why the government can't just function and from a policy standpoint that where the economy really does work for everybody. And I think that there are ways to do that. And from kind of just a logical perspective, that's what I look at it from. Like, there's no reason that things can't be wherever. There's no reason we can't have a system where everybody is rising instead of one segment of people rising and another segment going down. Everybody can have their lives improved.
Amen. Love that.
So I want to hone in, though, on a little bit of, I'm fascinated by these, I think we all are, like these like juncture points, right? Where you have this fundamental fork, this fundamental choice. And then to your point, to both of your points, all of your set of experiences and values and core beliefs, and really critically, the people around you and the thickness of those social relationships. So Dan, I mean, you had this pivotal kind of shift or evolution, and it doesn't really in reality bear out in one moment, right? Where you decide like, I'm going to raise the floor from 0 to 70K. But can you speak to like the challenges, the struggles, the sacrifices, in that particular transition? And do you kind of see it as like a pre and post, like a like life before and life after? And how did you get through that hump? Because there is this adaptive valley of despair or struggle or pain or questioning things, of ambiguity. And if you can come out at the other end of it, you have these superpowers. And so just walk us through, give us some light into that process.
Well, I'm going to say that I think that we're all brainwashed a little bit, like everyone, like I am. And I try to become just slightly less brainwashed as much as possible, because I think that's, well, I just think it's really helpful, right? Because, we like, Noam Chomsky has written about this a lot, but like there's so much like sense of conformity that's taught to us, first of all. But then secondly, if you look at like some of the research around like confirmation bias and how we have the ability to basically tune out 99.9% of information and take in the 0.1% of information that reinforces our beliefs. When you put those two together, like that's a powerful force, and every single one of us is subjected to that. And Daniel Kahneman, has done some work that suggests like learning that happened to you doesn't necessarily help you not do it, which is very counterintuitive. Yeah, so it's like, just because like I learned about that, like I have no now ability to be arrogant and be like, I'm not doing it and you still are. Like, in fact, the opposite's true. And so when you put those two together, I think you have to some degree conclude that we're all subject to some amount of brainwashing. And the way that we think the hierarchy goes is, first I think it, then I do it. And I think that the way to overcome the brainwashing is actually the opposite of that. And that's what's so counterintuitive. So I think my actions lead my thoughts because of that confirmation bias. Our brains are trying to prove to ourselves that we're a good person, that we made good decisions. So whatever decision you make, like your brain is a powerful force to justify that decision. Decisions are generally made emotionally. And like the 70K decision, I knew all of the statistics. I had read Daniel Kahneman. I had read all that stuff for years before that. Why didn't I put it into practice? It was an emotional moment. I was on a hike with a woman named Valerie Molina, and her and I used to date. I was in love with her at one point. This was afterwards. We were friends. But I always thought about the financial divide between me and her and how it made our relationship really difficult. She is an amazing person. She served 2 tours in Iraq, 11 years. She enlisted in the Army when she was 18 years old. Single mom, like just everything that you would think you would want to like value in society, and everything that UBI and other things do value in society. Like she had all of it. She works hard. She was entrepreneurial. She was a GM of a spa. And then on the side, she was taking like work, like managing homes and pets and things to make extra money. And she told me about how a $200 rent increase was throwing her life into chaos. And I was just so emotionally upset that I made like an emotional decision. You know what I mean? Right. As crazy as it sounds, I had all the logic to support it ahead of time, but I needed that emotional domino. And now, having gone through that experience and having kind of lived to tell about it, both, truly and also metaphorically from a business standpoint, like it shaped my beliefs more so than my beliefs shaped it. And I think that's the important point for the audience is if you want to change your thoughts, if you want to, for example, be happier, if you want to be more altruistic, if you want to be more connected, if you want to work higher up Maslow's hierarchy of needs to like self-actualization, like what you need to do is actually risk and sacrifice. And you can train yourself, you can train your brain to see that when you take a risk or a sacrifice to invest in humanity over your own ego, then you can backfill the logic for why that was a good decision, and it can encourage you to make those decisions. So, you know, it's just like something simple, like, you know, doing something nice for somebody, like giving somebody something. That's what I love about this, you know, kind of direct cash program that you were promoting at the beginning of the show, is because like just doing something good for somebody else leads your thoughts and shows you how much it can help you. And that was the order of how it went for me. So the reason why I agree with you on the pre and post is because I'm a completely different person, but it was less about evolution decision. It was more like decision and then evolution. And that's the leap of faith that we have to take. And you can apply that to, you know, to like Medicare for all. You could apply it to UBI. You could apply it to basically saying that education and opportunity is going to be a human right. You could apply it to campaign finance reform and say, we don't want the people with all the money having all the political control. We want the political control to be distributed. You can apply it to all of these things. We have to find, as a society, those little moments of progress, those decisions, if we can make those decisions. And that's why elections have such big consequences, because when you elect somebody that goes against your values, it shifts the culture, it shifts the values. The good news is those things can change if you start to pass laws and have elections that aspire to kind of the highest values of Americans rather than some of the more kind of like instincts that are negative. And I think the basic debate between me and Rush Limbaugh that we've been having for the past 5 years is, I think people are capable of good if they have resources and if they have leadership and if they have a good culture to support it. And Rush believes, I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but it seems like he believes basically everyone's bad, so you should be bad first. And that's the difference.
There's so much here. You know, we could go on for hours, but I want to be mindful of the time, and I'll just bring in two things that were alluded to, and then bring in Matt. The first is Taleb's idea of having skin in the game, and the idea of taking a risk and having your own outcome, your own success tied to that of, let's say, your organization, your community, your nonprofit, your country. And I think that was just really profound and really has a lot of implications for how we design incentives and systems and institutions to make sure that, again, this kind of fundamental principal agent problem, where let's say in the case of business or management, I mean, you're not a public firm, but you can have a corporate board and management that are acting upon or representing the interests of stockholders and shareholders. But there's this fundamental divide because those interests are represented by proxy. The other, and then I'll shut up on this, is this Paul Graham essay that I read recently, which I thought really captured it well. He says, and I wouldn't say I subscribe to the general sort of accelerationist theory, but he says the whole bogus edifice is crumbling. To the extent so his kind of fundamental framing question is, to what extent do you win at work by hacking bad tests? And the way he defines bad tests is tests that are imposed by authorities. And what he suggests is that hacking bad tests, and this is ingrained in us from the earliest age, the fundamental industrialized model of education in the United States is to train the human to become obedient and to become a less efficient form of the machine. And what he claims is hacking bad tests is becoming less and less important as the link between work and authority erodes. And these types of bad tests, or the ways you can hack or game, are not just in the educational context when you're designing a test to measure your performance in a math class, let's say, but it really, again, scales up to the level of federal policy. Like a bad test that you can hack in the context of means testing, or like a bad test that you can hack in the context of how a workplace or an organization designs promotions, right? And how politics ends up scaling up when you have a larger, more bloated, bureaucratic organizations. So I thought these were just really fascinating. Again, going from the personal and the anecdotal and kind of reflecting on what that means for institutional design and policy generally. So I want to bring in Matt, and again, just mindful of everyone's time.
Yeah, certainly. I agree 100% that with what you said on Talib, in terms of, I think people do better when they're in terms of motivation and just the level of satisfaction that they can feel when their goals and their kind of outcome is tied to things like community and just the people that you surround yourselves with. And I think it goes back kind of touching on the beginning of the conversation, what Dan said, where you have this system right now where money and purpose are kind of tied together, but I don't necessarily think they should be tied together, because I personally don't really think that money makes you happy. I think money is a great tool that sucks to not have and will make your life a lot easier if you have it. But at the end of the day, it's not gonna, you can only sit on the beach and drink martinis for so long before you look around and you're like, what am I doing with my life? So
a lack of money keeps you from being happy, but more money doesn't make you happy, is another way of saying it.
Yeah, certainly. So I think that's kind of my general thoughts on this question. The second quote is pretty, it goes pretty deep in terms of the hacking, bad tests, and the importance of work and authority eroding. I don't know if that's something that you'd be able to touch on, Dan, more. But
well, yes, absolutely. So our industry, when I joined our industry, granted I was a kid, so maybe I didn't know any better, but I was like, I don't want sales commissions, because my salespeople then could be put into a place where by signing an account, they can support their family. But what if signing that account, although it's good for my business, what if it's not good for that small business? And so I've gotten the best feedback that, like, on my salespeople, that like they'll tell our, if somebody's not a good fit, probably 9 out of 10 people that call us up and say, I want to do business with Gravity, for whatever reason, like, we're just not the best solution for them. And so we'll just tell them we're not the best solution for you. And at the time, it was a huge risk and a huge departure, because in my industry, I'll take my biggest competitor at that time. They were called Heartland Payment Systems. They're now owned by a public company, Global Payments. And they were kind of like considered the gold standard, because they didn't pay any salary. They didn't have any guaranteed income for their salespeople, but they at least paid for some healthcare. Like, they at least had like a split in healthcare. Every other company, the salespeople got nothing, no healthcare, no guaranteed income, like nothing at all. And the other thing that was crazy was that competitor, Heartland, if you looked at their employee base, 80% of their employees were commissioned salespeople. 80% of the total employees for the company. And so like with our team, it's like more like 20% of the employees like work with sales or something like that. And they make no commission. And that was why. It was because there are these tests where all of a sudden, if you say, okay, the merchant, the small business needs to be a fit for us as a company, or I can't pay my mortgage, you will find a way to kind of cheat the info in your head with that incentive. and make it good. And so I think that, you know, Nassim Taleb touches on some of the solutions, but I also think that UBI touches on that, because I think if there's an incentive to do wrong or to cheat, but there's not a need to, a lot of people will not do wrong and will not cheat. But if there's a need to cheat, where you have to, or if you have a culture where it's a winner take all culture, where like the gains disproportionately go to the top 1% or the top 10% of financial performance, there's such a forced incentive there to cheat, because like second place gets nothing.
Right.
And you see that in like Tour de France, right? Lance Armstrong. It's like, well, everyone's cheating, so everybody has to cheat.
Right.
So I think that some of these like tests and some of this kind of like making it look good for the test, if you could have a little bit better safety net, if you had a UBI, and the way we have proved that at Gravity is, we don't sell as many accounts as our competitors do, but our attrition rate in terms of customers leaving us is less than half of what the rest of the industry faces. And so it may be short in terms of optics for shareholders, but in terms of the long-term health and viability of a company, it's better to have 16-year relationships with your customers than to be churning and burning through them every 3 to 5 years the way our competitors do.
Right. Fascinating. Can I just point out as well that apparently, seems to be public record, Dan Price was offered an apprentice-like reality show. Is this true, Dan? You were going to be the new Donald Trump on a show called $1 Billion Startup?
I mean, I've gotten a lot of kind of production offers, but just to kind of slow down that rumor a little bit, the way TV works is like, you know, they pitch like 20 concepts to have like, you know, 5 go to like a pilot, to have like 1 that actually reaches the air. And most of them never get any kind of outside of cultural obscurity. So, you know, it was kind of, I've been pitched a bunch of those, and I've never really gone down deep enough to know how real they are. You could have been the next
Donald Trump, Dan.
I certainly would not be super stoked to have people referring to me in that way. But I will say that when I started watching The Apprentice, because I was like so excited that there was going to be a show about business. I've been obsessed with business. There's finally a TV show. And then I watched it and I was like, this guy doesn't know anything about business. This sucks, you know? But what do I know?
Awesome. Well, I want to give everyone a chance to kind of give your reflections and wrap up and concluding thoughts. Obviously, we've solved all of the crises we're going through. We've really honed in and defined the crystal clear optimal policies to address them all. We got the map hat, we got the forward sweater, we got the map pin, we got the whole collection. We can even put a plug for the Yang store that's closing. Anyway, but before that, I want to say, very exciting, we will be having on next week, if you tune in next Thursday at 7 p.m., the epic, the rock star moral philosopher Michael Sandel on. And so that'll be next Thursday, April 30th, 7 p.m. So subscribe, like, comment, share, because how lucky are we to have minds and hearts like these? So yeah, I want to let Dan and Matt conclude and reflect, but really thank you all so much. This is so fun. And yeah, just really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to thank Dan kind of for your leadership. I can imagine, you know, going back to the quote that Joanathan read at the very beginning with, you know, kind of everybody in the business world, all the CEOs and the competing companies kind of, you know, it's like, feels like it's one person against 100, you know, and you're outnumbered. And it's got to be sometimes not the best feeling. But with all that said, you just stuck with your principles and what you believed in. And I think that's really admirable and something that a lot of people can take with them and try to incorporate in their own, whether it's their business or their personal life. And also, thank you for being a part of this, the movement here, the math movement, whatever, the Yang Gang, supporting Andrew Yang, because it brought so many amazing people and so many amazing minds together. So it's incredible, and I'm glad you're part of it.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for the time. I'll just conclude with support small businesses all that we can through this. You know, they are really important to our communities. I've been trying to raise awareness about even things like Uber Eats takes 30% of restaurants when you order delivery. If you can do it while safely social distancing, you know, picking up the food, ordering directly from the restaurant, not through an app. You know, at Gravity, we have technology that allows for those sorts of things for every type of business. You know, even like something like a veterinary clinic right now, you know, you can kind of be served from your car. They'll come out to the car, and, you know, having things like text to pay and all those types of things to keep social distancing up. Those are things that will allow those small businesses to continue to thrive even after COVID-19. And hopefully it is a forcing mechanism, you know, for those that are, you know, fortunate and make it through this, to like allow them to upgrade some of their technology. So we're basically working around the clock. I mean, I'm working, I don't know, 18 hours a day right now, 16 hours a day trying to make that happen. But I literally have 100 hours a day of work. And it's funny because we're in a situation where we've lost half of our revenue. We're losing like $20,000 every single day, and yet busier than we've ever been, and like having that like time clock like ticking down. So if you want to support us at all, like connecting us with your local small businesses, there's basically two things that we do. Make it cheaper to get paid on a credit card, number one. And number two, have all the technology you need to have all those mediums in every industry and allow for social distancing, all those sorts of things. And we've just recently announced a program because we're aware of the fact that 26 million people have lost their job in the last several weeks. So we announced a program called the Small Business Champion, because I've literally had 10,000 people ask me for a job on Twitter over the last several years. And it's a program where anybody basically can sign up to be an ambassador for Gravity and like tell your local businesses about us. But even nothing about us, just support your small businesses however you can. You know, tip people at restaurants, tip people at grocery stores, like tip our frontline people right now that are heroes. Take care of your health, like think about your health, your friends and family, the people that you love. Like those are the most important things. The money should come second to your health, your vitality, your family. And I'm sorry for everybody out there that's suffering right now because of a lack of money, because we didn't put the right policies into place as a society. That's a failure of all of us, and we all need to take responsibility for that. So I'm sorry, but I also just want to encourage you that if you do find ways to put your health, your happiness, your family first in this crisis, you know, we can have light at the end of the tunnel. And then I would say, on a political note, don't be a perfectionist right now. It's not the time to be a perfectionist. Vote for the candidates that support you the greatest, support, you know, what you believe in the greatest. Try to join those. And even if, you know, your favorite candidate, you know, didn't make it or whatnot, like that sucks. And I'm sorry to hear that. But I will still say that these elections just have such serious consequences. So if you're out there thinking that you're just going to opt out politically, you give all the political control to the people at the top who are not aligned. Those are the only people that aren't aligned to your interests. And be skeptical about, you know, the messages that might be aligned to their interests, because they have a huge amount of resources, funds to put into misinformation. They start, you know, these kind of nonpartisan think tanks that throw out, you know, bad ideas and get us talking about things that benefit them. So think about that focus for yourself, keep an open mind. And we have to, I've always tried to stay apolitical because it's not really good for my business to be political. But you know, over the past 5 years, I've just learned we can't afford that anymore. We have to be engaged politically. We have to be supporting people like Joanathan that are out there fighting for us, and other people that represent your values. And maybe you don't agree with every single thing that Joanathan does or other people out there, but if you agree with where he's going to take us, where other candidates are going to take us, we need to, you know, support financially if we can. We need to support with our public voice if we can, and we need to raise our voices in unison to solve these problems. If we do, we'll solve it and the world will be a great place. If we don't, we're on a really precarious path. So thanks for having me on, Joanathan and Matt.
Absolutely. Thank you
guys so much. You're epic.
Appreciate you, Joanathan.
Yang gang. You got the cap on back.
All right. Hope for an in-person hug sometime.
I love it. Let's make it happen.
Take care, everybody.